My name is Cole, and I grew up in a household where the rules were pretty clear. My older brother, Nathan, was the shining star, and I was the one expected to quietly fill the background. He was the promising one, the golden ticket, the son who would carry the family name into greatness. Meanwhile, I was the reliable one, quiet, consistent, never causing trouble, but never praised either. From a young age, it was obvious where my parents' loyalty lay. Nathan could break something, lose something, or fail at something, and it was brushed off as a learning experience. If I so much as questioned anything, it was taken as me being ungrateful. It became almost laughable over time, though at the time it stung more than I wanted to admit. By the time we were both in college, the favoritism was like second nature. Nathan switched majors 3 times, took an extra year and a half to finish, and somehow managed to convince my parents he was just finding his calling. Meanwhile, I graduated on time, with a degree in computer science, landing a modest but stable job right out of school. My parents congratulated me with a half-hearted dinner at a chain restaurant. When Nathan finally scraped by with his diploma, they threw him a catered backyard party complete with speeches, decorations, and my mom crying as though he'd just won an Olympic medal. I tried not to care. For years, I told myself that as long as I could carve out my own path, their bias didn't matter. But it always circled back. Every holiday, every gathering, it was Nathan's brilliance being discussed, Nathan's plans being financed, Nathan's failures being rebranded as stepping stones. The breaking point didn't come suddenly. It was built brick by brick. Nathan decided he wanted to start his own business. Of course, he had no savings, no plan beyond a half-baked idea involving some kind of luxury subscription boxes, and no experience. But my parents latched onto it like it was the next Apple. Suddenly, every family conversation revolved around the startup. At first, I stayed quiet. I nodded when my mom gushed about how Nathan was meant to be an entrepreneur. I listened when my dad said that not everyone's cut out for corporate jobs like you, Cole. I bit my tongue when Nathan bragged about his vision, though I knew he was maxing out credit cards just to keep up appearances. Then one evening, during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house, the conversation shifted in a way that made my stomach drop. My mom set her fork down, leaned forward, and said, "Cole, your brother needs investors he can trust. We know you've been saving, and we think it's time you helped him get this off the ground." I blinked at her, unsure I'd heard right. "You're asking me to invest?" Nathan smirked like the whole thing had already been decided. "Not invest exactly. More like lend. 50,000 should be enough for the initial push." I almost laughed, but the tension in the room was too heavy. My parents stared at me as if this was the most natural request in the world. I had worked for years, living frugally, building up savings, and here they were, sitting across the table, expecting me to hand over nearly everything I had to cover Nathan's latest dream. When I didn't answer right away, my dad cleared his throat. "Cole, think about it. This is family. Your brother's success will benefit all of us. Besides, you've got a stable job, you'll earn it back. But Nathan, he needs this chance." I finally found my voice. 50,000? That's my savings. That's my security. You're asking me to risk everything for a subscription box business that doesn't even have a customer base. Nathan rolled his eyes. "It's called vision. You wouldn't understand." That line, those words, flipped a switch inside me. For years, I'd swallowed the favoritism, the unfair comparisons, the endless stream of excuses for Nathan. But being told I should empty my savings for his vision was too much. I pushed my chair back and stood. "I'm not giving you money. Not a loan, not an investment, not anything. I worked hard for what I have, and I'm not throwing it away." The silence was deafening. My mom's expression hardened instantly. My dad's jaw clenched. Nathan smirked, but this time it was tinged with something uglier, like he was already plotting how to spin this against me. That was the night I knew something had to change. I went home with my mind racing, and over the next few weeks, I started planning. I updated my resume. I reached out to connections I'd been too hesitant to call before. I started quietly looking into opportunities far away from home. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated, an offer that doubled my current salary in a city across the country. The day I signed the contract, I didn't tell my parents. I didn't even hint at it. But 2 hours later, as though she could sense something was slipping out of her control, my mom texted me, "Don't you dare spend Christmas without covering Nathan's debt." I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding. It wasn't even a request anymore. It was a demand. Like my future, my savings, my choices weren't mine to control. That night, something inside me snapped. I sat down at my computer, pulled up every joint account, every family subscription, every shared plan. One by one, I cut ties. By morning, I had 60 missed calls and texts waiting for me. When I woke up the next morning and saw the sheer number of missed calls, my first thought was that something terrible had happened. 60 missed calls, 47 text messages, 3 voicemails. My hands actually shook a little as I scrolled through them, wondering if there had been some kind of emergency. But then I started reading. Every message was about one thing: money. From my mom. "Cole, what did you do? The family account isn't working. This isn't funny. Your brother is panicking. You need to fix this now. Answer the phone. Don't you dare ignore us." From my dad. "You're being childish. Undo whatever nonsense you did last night. Your brother is under enough stress. Don't add to it. I'll call the bank myself if I have to." And from Nathan, sprinkled in between theirs. "Real mature, Cole. You're ruining Christmas. Do you realize how selfish you sound? Grow up." Not once, in all those messages, was there a single question about me. Not one, "Are you okay?" Or "Why did you do this?" It was all about how my actions inconvenienced them. That was the moment it truly sank in. This wasn't about family. It never had been. I was just a resource to them, an ATM with a pulse. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My emotions were a tangle of anger, sadness, and this strange sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I had done something that wasn't about them. I had drawn a line in the sand, and even though I knew it would cause chaos, it felt liberating. By midday, my phone rang again. I recognized the number, my mom. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Cole," she started, her voice sharp, but trying to mask it with that tone she always used when she wanted something. "What is going on? Do you think this is funny? Cutting off the accounts, ruining your brother's progress, embarrassing us like this?" I took a deep breath. "Mom, those were my accounts too. My money. My subscriptions. I don't owe Nathan anything. I don't owe you anything." There was a pause. Then her voice hardened. "Don't you talk to me like that. We raised you. We supported you. After everything we've done, this is how you repay us." I almost laughed at the word supported. But I didn't. Instead, I said quietly, "You didn't support me. You tolerated me because I didn't need bailing out like Nathan. That's not the same thing." She gasped, as though I'd just insulted her directly. "That is ungrateful. Absolutely ungrateful. Your brother is working toward something important. He is building a legacy, and you're what? Sitting behind a computer? Do you really think your job compares to what he's trying to do?" Her words stung, even though I'd heard versions of them all my life. The dismissal, the constant belittling. But this time, I didn't argue. I just said, "My job pays my bills. My job gives me stability. That's enough." Before she could respond, I hung up. For the next 2 days, the storm didn't let up. I muted the group chat they created specifically to guilt-trip me, where every message was some variation of "fix this" or "you're tearing the family apart." Nathan even posted screenshots of supposed investors backing out, blaming me directly. The irony was almost too much. He hadn't secured any investors to begin with. It was smoke and mirrors, just like everything else he did. Meanwhile, at work, things were shifting. My new company was already sending me relocation materials, offering to cover moving expenses, housing assistance, even a signing bonus once I officially started. I couldn't help but notice how different it felt to be valued, truly valued, for what I brought to the table. It was intoxicating in a way I wasn't used to. But the guilt, it lingered. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because years of conditioning don't just disappear overnight. Every time I ignored a call, I heard my dad's voice in my head telling me, family comes first. Every time I deleted a guilt-ridden text, I remembered the endless nights as a kid trying to prove myself to people who never really saw me. 3 days later, my dad showed up at my apartment. I'll never forget the sight of him standing in the hallway when I opened the door. He wasn't angry, not outwardly. He had that calm, rehearsed expression he used in business meetings. The kind that said, "I'm in control here." "Cole," he said smoothly, stepping past me into the apartment without waiting for permission. "We need to talk." I shut the door and followed him into the living room. "You're here unannounced. That's not okay." He waved a hand dismissively and sat down on my couch. "You've made your point. You're upset. Fine. But now it's time to put an end to this nonsense. You're going to transfer the money to your brother, and we'll consider this resolved. I stood there, stunned by the arrogance. You really think you can just walk in here and order me around? His eyes narrowed. I'm not ordering you. I'm telling you what needs to be done. You think you're being strong, but you're being reckless. You're burning bridges you'll regret someday. Bridges? I repeated, my voice shaking. What bridges? You've made it clear my role in this family is to fund Nathan's dreams. That's not a bridge, that's a leash. And I'm done with it. For the first time, his composure cracked. His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward. Don't push us, Cole. Your brother's future depends on this. And if you think for 1 second we're going to let you jeopardize everything he's worked for. I cut him off. What he's worked for? He's worked for nothing. He's coasted his entire life because you and Mom carried him. And now you expect me to carry him too? No, I won't do it. The room went silent. My dad stared at me like he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him. For once, I didn't back down. I didn't soften my words to avoid conflict. I stood there, meeting his gaze, refusing to let him bulldoze me the way he always had. Finally, he stood. You're making a mistake. A mistake you'll regret when you realize family doesn't forget things like this. He left without another word. The second the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My hands were trembling, but there was a strange exhilaration coursing through me. For the first time in years, I had stood up to him and not caved. The next few days were a mixture of relief and mounting tension. On one hand, I finally felt free, like I was breathing without someone pressing down on my chest. I spent hours arranging my move across the country, packing up my small apartment, and contacting my new company about the details of relocation. I even allowed myself to imagine a life where my family's opinions didn't dictate my choices. It was a strange and intoxicating thought, almost surreal. But on the other hand, the storm wasn't letting up. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, half expecting it to be my parents or Nathan trying to bend me back into submission. Even though I'd blocked some numbers, they always found a way: group texts from unknown numbers, emails, even messages through social media accounts I barely used. Every message was another tug at the leash I had just severed. It escalated on Friday morning. I woke up to an email from Nathan's assistant, which I hadn't even known existed. The subject line read, "Cole, immediate action required." I clicked it, expecting another guilt trip, but what I found was something more insidious. "Cole, the investors are reconsidering their support. This is critical. Please wire funds immediately to cover initial costs. Nathan cannot continue without your assistance." I reread it 3 times, hoping maybe I had misinterpreted it. Nope. They had created an illusion of urgency, a false emergency designed to manipulate me. My pulse started to rise, but I took a deep breath and deleted the email. I wasn't going to give in. Not now, not ever. By late afternoon, I started receiving texts from my parents again. My mom's were filled with manipulative phrasing. "You'll ruin everything if you don't help. We're counting on you. How could you do this to your brother?" While my dad's took a more strategic angle, almost like a lawyer mapping out potential consequences. "Cole, you are risking family unity. Consider the long-term fallout." But the most interesting, and perhaps most revealing, were Nathan's messages. They were becoming increasingly desperate, even reckless. "Cole, we trusted you. I can't believe you're doing this. Mom and Dad are furious. Do you want the family to hate you forever? You don't understand what you're jeopardizing." What struck me most was the underlying threat in all of it. Not a direct one, but a tone that suggested if I didn't comply, they would make sure I paid in some other way. My family had always had a way of weaponizing guilt, embarrassment, and even social perception to control me. This was just the next level. By Saturday morning, I realized I couldn't just ignore it. They would keep escalating until they broke me, or at least tried. I decided to preempt them. I contacted a few friends from college, letting them know the situation. I even considered hiring a legal consultant, not because I needed one immediately, but because I wanted to understand my options. This was no longer a family squabble. It was an orchestrated attempt to manipulate me financially and emotionally. That evening, I got a call from my mom. Unlike before, she didn't yell or demand. Instead, she was eerily calm, like a storm just below the surface. "Cole," she said softly, "we know you're moving. That's fine. But you need to understand, family expectations don't disappear just because you relocate. Nathan's debt is still yours to cover. And if you think leaving the city makes this easier, think again. I could feel my jaw tighten. Mom, I don't owe him $50,000. Not now, not ever. And I won't be dictated to by threats. She laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. You've always been stubborn. Always the responsible one who plays it safe. But this is bigger than money. You're deciding who you are, who you want to be. And I warn you, decisions have consequences. I hung up. The call left me unsettled, not because I doubted myself, but because I realized just how far my parents and Nathan were willing to go. They weren't just going to let me walk away. Not quietly. The next morning, while I was packing boxes, I got another shock. A package left at my door. It was addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a stack of printed emails, letters, and statements, carefully organized. On top was a note. Cole, this is everything you need to know about your brother's situation. We have been honest and transparent. Please reconsider. You are making a mistake. I flipped through the pages. They weren't just emails or documents. They were a meticulously crafted narrative, designed to convince me that Nathan was on the brink of collapse because of me. There were even falsified financial statements showing supposed investor interest lost due to my refusal. I felt my stomach turn. They had gone to the effort of creating fake documentation. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was an attempt to fabricate reality itself to control me. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. That afternoon, I started to finalize my move, moving boxes into the rental truck. I thought maybe leaving town, cutting physical ties, would give me space to breathe. But just as I was loading the last box, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize flashed on the screen. It was Nathan. Cole, he said before I could even greet him. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge I had never heard before. I know you think you're smarter than us. I know you think you can outrun this. But you can't. You've already caused irreparable damage. Mom and Dad are angry beyond reason. And now, I'm angry too. I froze, the words hitting me like a punch. Angry? I asked cautiously. Yes. Angry, he repeated. You think walking away fixes anything? You think cutting accounts, deleting messages, ignoring us, this changes who you are in the family? It doesn't. You've crossed a line, Cole. And now, things are going to change. Before I could respond, he hung up. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I'd expected anger, guilt-tripping, maybe even passive-aggressive messages. But his tone, it was different. It wasn't the bratty, entitled voice I'd known my whole life. This was calculated, deliberate, almost predatory. And in that moment, I realized they weren't just upset that I refused to give money. They were plotting. They were planning. And I had no idea what they were capable of now that the subtle manipulation wasn't enough. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, I locked the apartment door, slid the last box into the truck, and stared at my reflection in the glass. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hunted. When I say the next few weeks felt like a slow, deliberate unspooling, I mean it in the most literal way possible. I moved across the country with a truck full of boxes and a quiet apartment that smelled faintly of cardboard and new carpet. I started the job 2 weeks later, signed paperwork, met my team, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to explain who I was in terms of someone else's failures or successes. Work was steady, validating in a way that felt honest, not the performative applause I grew up with, but real appreciation for skills I'd earned. But the family noise didn't fade. If anything, it got stranger. The calls and texts turned into other tactics. There were small things at first. My old landlord called asking about a bounced check. She'd been looped into the narrative that I'd sabotaged something. Strangers DMing me with screenshots of Nathan's press releases, and even an anonymous email to my new company casting doubt on my integrity. Whoever was orchestrating this knew how to poke without getting blood on their hands. I took it step by step. No dramatic confrontations, no public tantrums. The first move was to get quiet documentation. I'm a software engineer. I trust logs, timestamps, receipts. Data doesn't gaslight you. I backed up everything. Texts, emails, the printed package my mom dropped off, screenshots of fake investor emails. I cataloged messages by date, by sender, by tone. When Nathan's assistant sent me the fake wire request, I saved the header info, sender IPs where I could, and archived the source. It felt a little petty at the time, but when you've been unfairly blamed your whole life, petty can become armor. Next, I found a lawyer. Not the melodramatic sort, but a practical one recommended by a colleague who dealt with workplace harassment. I needed to know my rights, what constituted harassment, and whether any of the fabricated material crossed into libel or fraud. The lawyer listened, nodded, and then said two words that steadied me more than I expected: paper trail. She explained how we could compile my documentation into a coherent file that would be useful if things escalated: civil suit, restraining orders, even criminal referrals if we could prove falsification or impersonation. Armed with legal advice, I started to play smarter. I called the bank and froze my old joint account. Legally, I had every right. We'd been co-owners on some services. I changed passwords, enabled two-factor authentication, and set up notifications so I would see if any new accounts were created in my name. I notified my new HR about the anonymous smear email, and they put a note on my profile. Small, mundane administrative things, but they created an institutional paper trail too. I wasn't just fighting fire with fire. I was building a firewall. But I also needed something else: leverage. My family, especially my parents, responded to one currency they respected: reputation. My dad's entire family identity was built on appearances, on the idea that they handled money, investments, and serious business. If I could make their credibility wobble, even a little, it would sting in a different place than money. That didn't mean public shaming. I learned quickly that public attacks could boomerang, but targeted exposure could neutralize their ability to manipulate others. I started quietly reaching out to people Nathan had named as investors or partners in his pitch. Many of them turned out to be non-existent, or simply friends he described as interested. A few, however, were real people who had been casually CC'd on drafts and then ghosted when Nathan didn't deliver. I gently asked questions. I sent polite emails asking for confirmation of commitments and timelines. A couple of people replied with bemused, "We were never involved" messages. Those were the ones I saved and forwarded to my lawyer. At the same time, I cultivated allies close to home. Old friends from college, the ones who'd seen exactly how Nathan operated, quietly offered to be witnesses to patterns of behavior. Instances where he'd borrowed money and never repaid. Times when my parents had bailed him out for consequences they'd refused to hold him accountable for. A coworker, an HR manager, suggested I document every interaction on company time when family messages crossed into the workplace. Her advice was practical and precise. Never react in anger, always respond in writing, preserve timestamps. I won't lie, there were nights I sat awake thinking of simpler retaliations. It would have been satisfying to post everything on a public forum, to name and shame them in a way they couldn't silence. But the last thing I wanted was to give them an excuse to paint me as the unstable child. So I kept my mouth shut and let the documents accumulate. Every inbox screenshot, every urgent printed page, every voicemail got filed. There was a compact, cold satisfaction in watching the evidence stack up. For the first time, I could see a path where their narrative and mine might collide on equal footing. While I was building the case, I was also shaping the optics. My parents loved the drama of appearances. They couldn't stand being publicly questioned. With that in mind, I devised something that felt like chess. I would not attack them where they were strongest, their circle. I would instead arm their circle with truth, in measured doses, in ways that would create doubt rather than fury. At first, I leaked a small thing, a well-phrased email to a mutual family friend who'd acted as an advisor to Nathan in the early days. It read, simply, "Hi. I'm trying to clarify some commitments made on Nathan's behalf. Could you confirm whether you or any of your partners formally backed him?" The friend's reply was cautiously neutral. "I'd be surprised." I forwarded this to a colleague. "We'll take a look." I knew that a single equivocal answer wouldn't topple anything, but it planted a seed. Simultaneously, I started preparing for a confrontation that would be public enough to matter but controlled enough to avoid the messy pitfalls of viral shame. There was an industry networking event in my parents' town, an evening where local entrepreneurs, investors, and business owners gathered. Nathan had been angling to attend, to speak about his idea and drum up real interest. It seemed like the perfect place to let their house of cards wobble. I could either expose him publicly or, better yet, create a scenario where his claims would be questioned calmly and professionally. I reached out to one of the event organizers under the guise of curiosity and professional interest. I introduced myself as someone who'd recently relocated with plans to engage locally and mentioned I was intrigued by the lineup. The organizer, welcoming and used to polite networking ambushes, offered me an invite and a slot for a brief introduction if I wanted it. I didn't accept the slot. I took the invite and, more importantly, I asked quietly whether there would be any investors or journalists present. The reply was non-committal. A few local investors, yes. A regional business blogger often attends. That was enough. I now had a crowd that would notice if Nathan's story didn't hold up. If the right person casually mentioned that they hadn't been contacted for a follow-up, or if an investor asked for documentation he couldn't produce, Nathan would be on the defensive in front of peers, the worst place for someone who relied on charm and spin. While these plans knitted together, Nathan ramped up his own moves. He started showing up in places I never expected. My company's city, at tech meetups, and once, awkwardly, outside my workplace. Always by coincidence. Always with a performative bump into Cole vibe. At a meetup, he tried to corner me with a drink in hand and a rehearsed grin. "Small world," he said, as if that explained everything. "You moved fast. Must be nice." "Surprised you're here," I replied calmly. "Thought you were busy with scaling." He scoffed. "Scaling takes time. But I'm hustling. You know how it is." I let him talk and listened for the seams in his story. He had a way of talking as if reality would catch up to him, like words themselves could build a company. I kept my responses short and non-committal. If he wanted to create noise, fine. I didn't have to respond to every beat. A week before the networking event, things took a darker turn. My inbox pinged with an unfamiliar subject, legal notice. The message contained a scanned letter that appeared to come from a small claims court clerk, alleging I owed Nathan a sum for some agreement, a sum that matched the amount they'd been demanding. It was clumsy and obviously fabricated. The seal was low quality, the dates inconsistent. But whoever'd put it together hoped it would rattle me. It did what it was supposed to do for about an hour. Then my lawyer walked me through why it was meaningless and how to respond. That night, over takeout and a spreadsheet open on my laptop, we drafted a calm, legally worded reply. Present the facts, request original documentation, and state plainly that I would pursue remedies if the falsification continued. It was not dramatic. It was boring. It was precisely the kind of boring response that kills a con job. I filed the reply, CC'd it to my lawyer, and sat back. The next morning, my parents escalated in a way I'd been bracing for. Nathan published a glossy-looking one-page update on a tiny local business forum, claiming investors had pulled out because of personal family conflicts and attaching the same doctored bank statements my mom had printed for me weeks earlier. The post was performative, meant to get sympathy and to paint me as disruptive. People chimed in with the sympathetic little emojis, and "so sorry," Nathan replies. My stomach went cold. They were trying to manufacture sympathy to replace the credibility they'd lost. I did not respond publicly. Instead, I reached out privately to the forum moderator with a short, factual message. This post contains falsified documents and accusations. I can provide evidence showing this to be false and would like to discuss removing the post pending verification. I attached a handful of screenshots demonstrating the forgeries. 2 hours later, the post was taken down with a terse moderator note, "Under review." The removal felt like a small victory. It didn't solve anything, but it temporarily stopped the bleed of their narrative into public spaces. More importantly, it signaled to me that my strategy, measured, document-backed, and patient, was working. The day of the industry event arrived with the kind of unremarkable weather that makes everything feel normal. I drove back to my hometown, ostensibly for a short visit and to check on logistics for my parents' house. They'd sent a message about things needing attention, a thinly veiled power play. I kept my head down, arrived early, and watched the room fill. Nathan walked in with the practiced swagger of someone expecting applause. He greeted people, spun his story, and, crucially, accepted invitations to talk to a few potential investors. He smiled for photos and gave the kind of confident answers that work in living rooms and at holiday tables. But there was a difference tonight. I'd seeded small doubts everywhere. A couple of investors I'd spoken to earlier were present, and a regional blogger who'd attended many panels was making notes as he listened. At one point, Nathan took the makeshift stage and began what I recognized as a polished elevator pitch. He talked about product market fit in ways that sounded impressive if you didn't know the metrics. He mentioned pilots with unnamed retailers and preliminary interest from investors without names. He called for support and implied that family friction was the only obstacle left. Then, after he stepped down to applause, a soft, professional voice cut through the hum. The regional blogger, a mild-mannered woman with a notepad, asked directly, "Nathan, could you clarify which investors you've secured and whether those commitments were conditional?" Several readers asked me to verify some of the claims you made in previous posts. The question landed like a pinprick. Nathan's smile faltered for the length of a breath. He glanced around, seeking reinforcement, and found only polite faces and raised eyebrows. "It's complicated," he said, the practiced cadence losing its polish. "We had verbal interest, but details are still being finalized." "That's fair," the blogger replied, voice steady. "Would you be able to share a copy of any signed term sheets or letters of intent? My readers are interested, and I'd like to be accurate." Nathan's eyes flicked to the investors nearby. One of them, an older gentleman in a wool coat, said quietly, "We were interested in a demo. We never signed anything." For a man raised on applause, the lack of public affirmation was its own erosion. I watched Nathan's composure become porous. He kept smiling, but the smile now had the tautness of someone who knows the next question will reveal more than he planned to show. I could have stood up there and shouted. I could have thrown down the stack of documentation showing the forged emails and fake wire notices. Instead, I stayed in my seat, breathing slowly. The advantage of letting the truth filter through other people's questions was that it removed the narrative of sibling feud and reframed it as business due diligence. As Nathan stumbled through answers, a few murmurs rippled through the room. One of the investors excused himself and approached him directly, asking a pointed question about traction metrics Nathan hadn't mentioned. Nathan offered vague percentages and projections, and the investor's face registered polite doubt. By the time the night ended, the online chatter had a different tone. The blogger posted a short piece, not malicious, just honest, noting that while Nathan had interesting ideas, he lacked verifiable investor commitments, and that some claims were inconsistent with public records. The post was careful not to name-call, but the implication hung in the air like the first drop of rain before a storm. Driving back to my temporary apartment that night, I felt a complicated relief. This wasn't a knockout blow. It was a small, surgical wound to a confidence that had always been inflated by family protection. But it was enough to change momentum. What I didn't expect was the reaction from home. The next day, my phone blew up, not with pleadings to consider once more, but with things far worse. Threats veiled as disappointment, vague messages about exposing me, and, most disturbingly, a voicemail from my father delivered in that cold, businesslike tone he reserved for negotiations. "Cole," he said, slow and deliberate, "you've started something you can't finish. We'll see you at Christmas." The message ended there, but the subtext was clear. I stared at the voicemail for a long time. My chest tightened. For weeks I'd built a quiet, rational case. For weeks I'd avoided the dramatic edges of revenge. But what the message implied made it impossible to stay purely defensive. There's a point where the reasonable approach becomes a waiting room for harm. I called my lawyer and walked her through the voicemail. She advised caution but also reminded me to prepare for escalation, monitor accounts, document everything, and consider filing for a restraining order if the messages continued in threatening ways. Her voice on the line was a steady anchor. That evening, with my files open and evidence organized, I dialed another number, an old friend from college who now worked for a small investigative firm. He owed me favors from 1,000 nights of beers and late-night debugging sessions. He listened without surprise and then asked, quietly, "Do you want me to look into the origins of those fake emails? Where they were sent from, if they used family networks, that sort of thing?" "Yes," I said, "and find out if anyone's been impersonating me or creating accounts in my name. I need to know who's pulling the strings." He didn't ask why. He'd seen Nathan and my parents in action a few times. He understood the capillaries of small-town reputations and how easily they could be manipulated. He promised to start the next day. I slept poorly, thinking small and large thoughts at once. Small, passwords I'd forgotten, places my parents might visit, friends they might call. Large, what it meant to sever ties with people who had raised you, and whether revenge, when defined as restructuring the truth so it matched reality, was worth the personal cost. 2 days later, my investigator friend called with preliminary findings. The fake wire requests had been uploaded from a cafe near my parents' neighborhood, but masked through a VPN. The printer quality of the forged documents matched a small budget print shop my mother used. The assistant email belonged to an account that had been recently registered with a throwaway address and linked, through a string of intermediaries, back to a phone number registered in my parents' name. It was the smoking gun I needed to prove coordination. It was also, in a twisted way, a relief, not because I wanted to see my family culpable on paper, but because ignorance had been replaced by knowledge. Ignorance had been a weapon in their hands. Now I had broken through to facts. That evening I sent a careful message to my lawyer and to a trusted few. I have evidence of falsified documents and coordinated impersonation. I'm not making a scene. I am preparing to respond if this continues. The message did exactly what I hoped and feared. It signaled that I had the mountain of paper, the legal counsel, and the quiet allies. It also made clear that silence was no longer an option for them. They'd been publicly questioned, and now they were exposed. What I didn't foresee was how quickly they'd pivot. My parents didn't retreat into shame. They doubled down, but this time not with documents and pleas. They did something much more personal and, to me, much more dangerous. They started aiming for my life outside our family drama. A week after I sent that message, I got a call from my company's HR. Someone had been circulating rumors about my family dispute during lunch breaks. A freelance journalist reached out asking for comment. An anonymous complaint had been filed with my landlord about noise coming from my apartment. The tactics were no longer just about money or reputation. They were harassment designed to destabilize me where I had built a new life. It was at that point I realized two things. 1. This fight was no longer something I could keep small and neat. 2. The best revenge wouldn't be an emotional eruption or a public humiliation. It would be a decisive, legal, and methodical stripping away of the tools they'd been using against me. Tools like reputation, plausible deniability, and selfish affection. So I planned. I planned for the long game. I arranged meetings with my lawyer to prepare cease and desist letters. I coordinated with my investigator to document a timeline linking each act to specific actors. I drafted a carefully worded complaint to the police that focused strictly on evidence, forged documents, impersonation, and coordinated harassment. I reached out to a counselor because, bluntly, surviving this with my sanity intact mattered. And then, as if pushed by a force I couldn't see, they made their next move. It was an escalation that pulled the private into the public in a way that could not be ignored. On a rain-thin Wednesday morning, I opened my email to find an invitation, one of those glossy, heartfelt letters my mother had a knack for composing. She'd invited friends, family, and community supporters to a holiday charity brunch she was hosting. The language was saccharine. In the spirit of family and giving, please join us. The guest list included people from my parents' social circle, members of the local business association, and, notably, several of the investors and bloggers who had attended the networking event. Under the invitation, in smaller font, my mother had written, "Cole will also be present. We hope this will be a chance for reconciliation." It was a provocation dressed as olive branch. I read it, then reread it. The brunch was not about reconciliation. It was about optics, a stage where my family could weave me back into their narrative. Repentant son, forgiven and embraced. I knew my attendance would be portrayed as capitulation. I knew my absence would be spun as continued estrangement. For the first time since I'd drawn that line, I felt truly cornered. The brunch was public, and my parents had invited witnesses they trusted. If I went, I might walk into a trap. If I didn't, they'd claim victimhood. Either way, they were trying to make the public square a tool against me. I sat at my desk, heartbeat even, and made a decision. I would go to the brunch, but not to be reconciled. I would go to confront, to calmly, professionally, and quietly present the facts to neutral witnesses. I would not yell. I would not cry. I would let the timeline and the evidence speak. I told no one but my lawyer and my investigator. I printed copies of the falsified documents alongside the originals, the emails with headers showing spoofed senders, the bank screenshots demonstrating that no wire requests were authorized, and the investigative notes tying the prints back to my parents' print shop. I framed my statements as a matter-of-fact presentation, a factual recounting of dates, messages, and people involved. On the morning of the brunch, I practiced what I would say. I rehearsed a calm voice, a steady cadence. I reminded myself again that this was not about revenge as theatrical spectacle. This was about reclaiming my narrative, exposing the falsity they relied on, and, if necessary, forcing authorities to act. I walked into the venue carrying a small folder of documents and a chest full of quiet fury. The room smelled of coffee and buttered scones. Conversations folded like pages. My parents were already there, smiling like hosts who had invited the world to watch them perform grace. My heart beat, not with panic, but with a focused kind of readiness. I took my seat across from them, folded my hands, and waited for the moment when I would finally speak. Just as the first course was cleared and the minister of the local business association rose to say a few words about community, my mother looked over and caught my eye. She smiled a practiced, porcelain smile and mouthed, very deliberately, 3 words: "Make me proud." I set the folder on the table. I slid it toward her, not harshly, but with firm intent. The room hushed, curious at the unspoken drama. When she opened it and saw the documents, the printed emails, the investigator's notes, the photographs of the print shop receipts, her face did something I'd never seen before. It moved past shock into something almost animal, a bright, dangerous focus. And then my father, who had been watching the room with a calm, controlled posture, leaned forward and said, very quietly, "Cole, what are you doing? This is our family." I looked up at him and for the first time addressed him not as my father, but as the man who'd taught me to measure worth in reputation and profit. "This is also my life," I said, "and I wanted this to be private. I wanted to give you a chance to stop, but you didn't stop." A hush fell over the table. The brunch paused like a boat suspended between tides. The organizer shifted in his seat, uncomfortable at how personal the situation had become in a room meant for public celebration. My mother's jaw twitched. "You're making a scene," she said, voice small but edged with fury. "You could have handled this privately." I took a breath. "I did handle it privately," I said. "I gave you a chance to stop falsifying things, to stop impersonating accounts, to stop dragging me into this. When that didn't happen, I prepared a factual timeline and informed the appropriate people." At that, someone in the corner, a local business owner I barely knew, cleared his throat and asked, gently, "Cole, can we see the documents?" His tone was neutral, curious rather than accusatory. I handed him a copy. He read, then looked at my parents with a gravity that made the room shift. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face, usually composed, was unreadable. Before anyone could say anything else, the front doors of the venue burst open. 2 people I had not expected to see walked in. An officer in plain clothes and a woman from the small business forum who'd removed Nathan's post days earlier. They approached our table with the quiet authority of people who'd been briefed. The officer nodded to me and said, "Cole, we need to speak with you outside. There have been additional complaints, and we'd like to document your statement." My mother looked from me to the officer, color draining from her face. My father cursed under his breath, a rare, audible sound of genuine danger. I stood up, folder in hand. The room suddenly very small and very loud. People were whispering. Someone murmured "scandal" under their breath. My parents' eyes were hard, not the accusatory hardness of before, but something like panic. I stepped outside into the cool air. The officer motioned for me to sit on a bench. He explained in a low voice that there had been an anonymous report of forged documents and harassment linked to our family, and that they were following up. He asked for my consent to collect my files. I gave it. The investigator from my friend had already left a copy at the station. The officer said their forensic unit could compare metadata and print quality. My phone buzzed with a new message, my father. It read, "Come home. Let's talk like family." I looked up at the officer, then at the church-like windows of the venue where brunch continued, oblivious. For the first time in my life, I felt like the center of a story that had started long before me and would continue long after. But I also felt something else, power. Not the hungry kind my family had always hoarded and weaponized, but a quieter, measured power born of evidence, support, and a refusal to be gaslit. I was about to hand over the last copy of my files when my phone vibrated again. This time it was a text from Nathan. "You think you can win? You think paper will stop us? Watch your back." I read it. I folded the phone back into my pocket. The officer asked if I wanted to include the message in my statement. I swallowed and nodded. As we walked back toward the entrance together, the rain had started, soft and steady. People were still inside, laughing, chewing, discussing the latest community grant. My parents were seated at the table, faces drawn, hands clasped. I felt something like resolve settle over me. I had not come here to exact petty revenge. I had come to dismantle the tools they'd used to control me. The police, the investigators, the bloggers, all of them were now witnesses in a way that mattered. We walked into the room and the chatter paused. My mother's eyes were fixed on me, and despite everything, for a split second, I saw the woman who'd once tucked me in and read stories. It lasted the span of a heartbeat, and then it was gone. I sat down across from my parents, the folder on the table between us, and I was ready to speak my truth to anyone who would listen. Then the doors slammed open again, harder this time, and three people I never expected to see at that brunch stepped inside. They moved with the purposeful stride of people who had information of their own. The room inhaled. I stared at them. One of them was someone whose name alone could change everything. The very investor Nathan had always mentioned in passing. The person who, if they confirmed Nathan's lack of commitments publicly, would tilt the town's opinion in a way I could not achieve alone. They looked at me, then at my parents, and said only two words. "You're done." The words, "you're done," hung in the air like a thunderclap. The investors and two colleagues I'd never met before, all people my parents had assumed would be on Nathan's side, were standing deliberately, a wall of quiet authority between me and my family. My mother's porcelain smile cracked first. My father's jaw tightened in a way that was almost painful to watch. Nathan, who had tried to slide into the room unnoticed, froze mid-step. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The folder on the table, the officers waiting to take statements, and now these unexpected allies did all the talking. It was a controlled chaos. Every word, every document, every question my mother or Nathan tried to voice was cut short by facts, evidence, or the patient silence of people who had heard enough excuses for one lifetime. The first to break was my mother. Her voice was brittle, sharp with the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes they are no longer in control. "Cole, this isn't, you don't understand. We were trying to help Nathan. We were trying." One of the investors held up a hand. "You created falsified documents, impersonated accounts, and attempted to manipulate someone into giving you money. That is not help. That is fraud and harassment. And the people you targeted, including your own family, have documented evidence." My father's eyes narrowed. He tried a different approach, intimidation. "These are private family matters. You're making a spectacle." I let a calm smile slip across my face, the one I'd been practicing for weeks. "Private? You've involved strangers, investors, companies, law enforcement, and a public forum. You've tried to paint me as reckless, dishonest, and ungrateful to cover your own schemes. That is not private. That is public deception. And it ends now." Nathan finally spoke, his voice tight and quivering under the weight of the room's attention. "Cole, this isn't fair. You're twisting everything." I shook my head slowly. "No, Nathan. I am documenting everything you did. Everything Mom and Dad encouraged you to do. You lied about investors, you created false urgency, you manipulated accounts, and you tried to drag me into your failures. I'm not twisting anything. This is reality, measured and recorded. And you're done using me as a scapegoat." The police officer stepped forward. "Given the evidence and witness statements we've collected, we'll be opening a formal investigation into the falsification of documents and coordinated harassment. You can expect follow-up interviews, subpoenas for records, and potential charges. This isn't personal, it's law." The hush in the room was absolute. My parents' faces went pale. They had never imagined consequences could be so public, so formal, so immovable. Nathan's confident veneer crumbled entirely. For the first time in his life, the spin didn't work. The audience was impartial. They could see the facts. I looked around the room. Friends, investors, and a few neutral community members had witnessed the unraveling. The moral authority I'd felt simmering over the past weeks was no longer hypothetical. My family's manipulation, greed, and entitlement were visible to anyone who cared to look. I didn't say another word. I didn't have to. The proof was there. The forged emails, the bank screenshots, the investigators' notes linking the print shop, the corroborating testimony of third parties. The legal presence made it official. The social presence made it undeniable. By the time the brunch ended, the room had emptied with polite murmurs, leaving my parents and Nathan behind. My father tried one last maneuver. "Cole, you think this is the end? You're still part of this family. You'll regret this." I met his gaze evenly. "The only thing I regret is ever believing you would act in my best interest. This is the end of that illusion. I am moving forward, and nothing you say or do will change that." My mother, now shaking slightly, turned away. "Cole, no," I said, cutting her off. "You and Nathan made your choices. I'm making mine. That's over." Nathan slumped into the chair, defeated. I had no satisfaction in gloating. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had dismantled the system of control they had relied on for years. No theatrics, no social media smear campaigns, no dramatics. Just truth, patience, and strategic evidence. Over the next few days, the fallout unfolded predictably. My parents attempted to contact me repeatedly, blocked numbers, emails, even certified letters. Every attempt went unanswered. Nathan tried to post updates about his startup on social media, but the investors who had been present at the brunch posted polite clarifications, exposing the lack of commitments. Within a week, the narrative they had tried to construct for years, that I was the obstinate, uncooperative sibling, was visibly discredited in the community. I settled into my new life. My work flourished. My professional reputation grew. I had proof of their misdeeds, a network of allies, and legal recourse if they tried any further harassment. I didn't forgive them. I didn't call them. I didn't attend family events, and they weren't welcome in my home. They had tried to manipulate, to coerce, to humiliate, and every tool they had used to control me had been turned into evidence against them. In the end, the situation was clear. My parents and Nathan were exposed as manipulators, liars, and abusers of trust. My life had been disrupted, but the structures of power they had relied on to dominate me were dismantled. I moved forward free of their influence, fully aware of their entitlement and cruelty, and prepared to live a life entirely on my own terms. And for the first time, truly, I was untouchable. In the weeks and months that followed, the fallout for my family was unmistakable. Nathan's startup quietly collapsed. The investors who had attended the brunch publicly confirmed he had no signed commitments, and the few online followers who had believed his claims quickly lost interest. He struggled to regain credibility, but everyone who mattered already saw the truth. My parents' social reputation took a hit too. Friends, neighbors, and members of the local business community quietly distanced themselves. Invitations to events stopped coming. The small network they had relied on to validate their entitlement shrank until they were isolated, left with nothing but each other and their resentment. Attempts to contact me were met with silence or formal legal responses, and over time they learned that the authority they had wielded over me no longer existed. For me, life moved forward. I focused on work, built a steady social circle, and finally felt free of the constant manipulation and financial coercion that had defined my family dynamics for years. Every Christmas, every birthday, every small interaction no longer carried the weight of obligation or guilt. I didn't forgive them, and I didn't need to. Their actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. In the end, I realized something crucial. The revenge wasn't about seeing them humiliated. It was about reclaiming my life, my independence, and my dignity. And for the first time in years, I could finally breathe, knowing they no longer had any power over me. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.